Aboard the vast alien space station orbiting a distant gas giant, Scott Gordon was the lone human among thousands of extraterrestrials. A 28-year-old mechanic from Earth, Scott was here to perform a simple task: repair the station's malfunctioning airlock doors and life support systems. However, as he worked, an ear-splitting alarm suddenly blared through the facility, and Scott knew something had gone terribly wrong. He looked up from his tools just in time to see a squad of armed Osean guards storming toward him, led by Janus, the beefy head of station security. Before Scott could even ask what was happening, the guards seized him roughly and began dragging him away. "Hey, what the hell?" Scott shouted, struggling against their iron grip, but the aliens just snarled at him to shut up. They hauled him into a dimly lit interrogation room and shoved him into a chair. Janus loomed over him, his scaly face twisted in a sneer. "Human? You stand accused of sabotaging this station's critical systems?" Janus growled. "We have evidence of your crimes." Scott's heart sank. "That's bull! I'm here to fix your damn station, not destroy it. I didn't do anything! The evidence is clear," Janus declared coldly. "And as the only human in ocean space, you have no rights. For your acts of terrorism against this station, I sentence you to immediate execution." Scott's stomach dropped as the horrible realization hit him. He was about to be killed for something he didn't do, with no way to prove his innocence or call for help. He was utterly alone and surrounded by hostile aliens who were eager to see him dead for their own twisted reasons. The guards punched and kicked him viciously, beating him bloody, then dragged his limp body through the corridors toward an airlock. Scott knew what was coming next. They were going to space him, leaving him to die in the merciless vacuum of space. As the airlock cycled open to the infinite black abyss, Scott lifted his head weakly, blood trickling from his mouth. He cracked a small, defiant grin at Janus and spoke his final sarcastic words. "I always knew you aliens were afraid of us. Guess I was right." With that, they shoved him into the airlock, sealing it behind him. As he was flung into the void, Scott's mind raced. He was about to die, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Humanity wouldn't let this stand. They would avenge him. His final thought before blacking out was one of pure, unadulterated fury. Humans would annihilate these scaly bastards. The escape plan Scott tumbled through space, his consciousness flickering as his body instinctively tried to hold its breath. But then he remembered his suit still had air, and he forced himself to breathe, calming the panic threatening to overtake him. His hands shook as he fumbled with the suit's controls, finally finding the thrusters. He fired them in short bursts, slowly stabilizing his wild spin until the station stopped careening crazily across his vision. He rotated to face the station, his blood boiling as he saw Janus standing in the viewport, a smug grin on his scaly face. Scott's eyes desperately scanned the station's exterior until he spotted it, the maintenance airlock he'd just repaired. It was only about 100 meters away. A crazy idea burst into his adrenaline-addled brain. Carefully angling his thrusters, Scott propelled himself toward the airlock, trying to keep his movements small to conserve fuel. It felt like forever as he drifted closer, the airlock growing larger in his vision. Finally, he grabbed onto the edge of the door, arresting his momentum. His gloved hand scrambled across the smooth metal until he found the access panel. Ripping it open, he stared at the crisscrossing wires inside. Come on, he muttered, tracing the circuits until he found the right connections. With shaking fingers, Scott hastily spliced and rerouted the wiring to override the normal airlock controls. The outer airlock door ground open, the station's atmosphere venting out in a violent gust. Scott felt his oxygen rapidly depleting as he kicked and clawed his way inside, hitting the inner door control with the last of his strength. The inner door slid shut, and air flooded back in as Scott collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. He ripped off his helmet, sweat-soaked hair plastered to his forehead. Staggering to his feet, he lurched over to a maintenance terminal. His fingers flew over the controls with practiced ease, calling up systems he wasn't supposed to have access to. All right, time to let the folks back home know what these scaly freaks tried to pull. He encrypted the transmission and sent it bursting out into the void. His heart still racing, Scott quickly scrubbed any trace of his intrusion from the system logs. Hearing shouts and thudding boots in the distance, Scott ducked out of the room and slipped away into the bowels of the station. "You goddamn aliens haven't seen the last of me," he growled under his breath as he vanished into the shadows. New allies. Scott curled up in the tight confines of a maintenance shaft, straining his ears for any hint of footsteps or voices. The metal walls pressed in around him as he held his breath, praying the ocean security goons would pass by without noticing his hiding spot. After several tense minutes, their heavy tread and guttural language faded into the distance. Scott knew his desperate plea for help was hurtling through space towards the human outpost, but it would take weeks to arrive. Even if they sent a rescue ship immediately, it would still be a long haul back. Scott was on his own, and he needed to survive until help could arrive. Cautiously poking his head out, Scott scanned the dimly lit corridor for any sign of movement. Seeing none, he slipped out of his hiding place, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. He crept along the passageway, ducking into alcoves whenever he heard a noise. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in over a day. Scott made his way towards the station's main storerooms, keeping to the shadows. As he approached the entrance, he spotted two Ozian guards standing watch. Scott's heart pounded as he weighed his options. He couldn't take them out in a direct fight, not in his current condition. He needed another way. An idea sparked in his mind, and Scott quickly backed away, retracing his steps through the station. After an intense 15 minutes of dodging patrols and hacking door locks, Scott finally managed to sneak into a small supply closet adjoining the main storerooms. He stuffed his pockets with nutrient bars and filled a pouch with water pouches, grabbing only what he could carry easily. Just as he was about to sneak back out, Scott heard voices approaching. He froze, then quickly ducked behind a stack of crates. Two ocean technicians entered the room, still talking. "Can't believe the human scum is still loose on the station," one of them grumbled. "I thought Janus said he'd spaced him." He escaped somehow," the other replied. "Probably had help from some other human-loving traitors. You know how sneaky their kind are." Scott gritted his teeth, knuckles whitening as he clenched his fists. "These bastards don't know the half of it," he thought angrily. The Ozians continued grumbling as they grabbed some tools and left. Scott let out a tense breath and crept from the room. He needed a more secure hideout, somewhere the Ozians wouldn't find him. For the next several days, Scott survived by hiding in ventilation ducts, sneaking through maintenance tubes, and stealing small amounts of food and water when he could. He narrowly evaded detection from the increasingly frustrated Ozian security forces and their surveillance drones. Sleep-deprived and twitchy with constant adrenaline, Scott grew more desperate. Hacking a console, he pored over schematics of the station, searching for any advantage. During one of these illicit sessions, the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor sent a jolt of panic through him. Scott smashed the door lock behind him and fled down a narrow access shaft. He slid down a ladder and turned to sprint away, only to crash headlong into a metal strut. Pain exploded across his brow as he collapsed in a dazed heap. Warmth trickled into his eye, and he swiped at it, his hand coming away smeared with blood. "Ah, hell," Scott groaned, probing the gash on his forehead. It wasn't life-threatening, but it hurt like a chap. The near miss left him shaken. He stumbled away, looking for a dark corner to hide and tend his wound. As he huddled in the shadows, wrapping a makeshift bandage around his head, the reality of his situation sank in. He couldn't run forever. The resistance grows. As Scott hid and healed, he began to observe the various species on the station more closely. The Ozians strutted about importantly, barking orders at other races. Most notably, they seemed to reserve special derision for the Seans, a tall insectoid species that made up most of the station's menial labor force. Scott watched from catwalks and through grates as the Seans toiled away, only to be berated, shoved, and smacked by their Ozian overseers for the slightest perceived fault. The more he saw, the more his simmering anger grew. Late one night cycle, Scott lurked in an overlooking ventilation shaft as a group of Seans worked to repair a malfunctioning plasma conduit. As one of the alien workers struggled to lift a heavy spanner wrench, an Ocean foreman roughly backhanded him, sending him crashing to the floor. The other Seans flinched, huddling together fearfully as the foreman ranted at them. Something snapped inside Scott. This was too much. Before he quite realized what he was doing, he was dropping from the ceiling, landing in a crouch between the foreman and the fallen Sean. The Ocean overseer stumbled backward in shock, eyes widening as he took in the wild-eyed, filthy, bloody human before him. The Seans shrank back in surprise and fear. "Please, I need your help," Scott said slowly, keeping his voice calm and unthreatening. "I'm trying to get off this station to get away from the Oceans. I can help you escape, too. I know you're afraid. I know they treat you like Deshak," Scott continued, jerking his head contemptuously toward the Ocean foreman, who still cowered behind him. "You don't deserve this. None of us do. We have to get out of here." There was a long, tense pause. Then one of the Seans, the one who'd been struck, stepped forward. He nervously extended one of his long, segmented forelimbs. "I am Zarek," he said haltingly. "We will help you, human, if you help us be free." Over the next week, Scott and his small group of Sean allies snuck through seldom-used corridors and maintenance tubes, avoiding Ocean's security forces. The insectoids, with their knowledge of the station's layout from their labor duties, guided Scott to hiding spots he never would have found on his own. The unlikely band quietly stockpiled meager supplies, stolen rations, tools that could be used as weapons, and a few precious oxygen canisters. Scott used his technical skills to slice into the station's systems when he could, trying to remotely disable security sensors along their planned escape route. "We're almost ready," Scott whispered to Zarek and the others as they huddled in a dimly lit cargo bay. "I've been watching the schedules. There's a small transport ship docking in Bay 94 tomorrow, offloading some machine parts. If we can get aboard, I can have us detached and away before the Oceans know what hit them." The Seans nodded solemnly, compound eyes glittering in the low light. They knew what was at stake, freedom or death. Just as Scott finished outlining the plan, there was a sudden clang from the far side of the bay. The group froze, mandibles and hands clenching reflexively. A single Sean, one of the youngest, stepped out from behind a pallet of crates. I'm sorry," he clicked, not meeting their eyes. "I had to." Before they could react, a stun grenade flew from the shadows, exploding in a flash of blinding light and nerve-frying sound. Scott and the Seans collapsed, twitching and disoriented. Ocean security teams boiled into the room, shock prods and stasis cuffs at the ready. Scott tried to shake off the effects of the grenade and frantically crawl away, but a neural whip lashed around his legs, sending him crashing to the deck. Through blurred, watering eyes, Scott saw the Seans roughly grabbed and dragged away, their weakened struggles futile. The traitorous young Sean stood to the side, head bowed as the Ocean officer clapped him on the shoulder approvingly. "Good work, drone. You will be rewarded for your service in capturing these dissidents." Seething with impotent rage and despair, Scott slowly raised his gaze to the Ocean officer standing over him. A grim, cruel smile spread across the alien's face. "Did you really think you could turn our own workers against us, human?" The Ocean sneered. "You and those bugs will pay the price for such treachery." The alien raised his shock prod, and agony exploded through Scott's body. The world went black as he convulsed on the deck. Against the odds, when Scott regained consciousness, he was alone in a tiny, featureless cell. His body ached and twitched with the after-effects of the neural assault. He dragged himself to a sitting position, despair washing over him. His one shot at help had failed. Because of him, the Seans were captured, probably being interrogated and tortured right now. He'd failed them, just like he'd failed to see through the Ocean's deception in the first place. He was still alone, still trapped, and Janus would be coming for him again soon, this time with no plans for a quick execution. Scott buried his head in his hands, hopelessness threatening to overwhelm him. He'd gambled everything on this escape plan, and he'd lost. The human outpost probably hadn't even received his message yet. He was out of ideas, out of options, out of hope. But as he wallowed in self-pity, a spark of defiance flickered to life in his chest. No, he refused to let it end like this. If he was going down, he would go down fighting. Scott dragged himself to his feet, ignoring the pain racking his body. He began to pace, his mind racing. He needed a plan, a way to strike back at Janus and the Oceans. Hours turned into days as Scott meticulously recalled every detail he could about the station's layout and security systems. He'd spent weeks crawling through every hidden maintenance shaft and access tunnel. He knew this place better than anyone. Slowly, a plan began to take shape, a desperate, reckless gambit, but it was all he had left. On the night he'd selected for his raid, Scott feigned illness, drawing the guard into his cell. As soon as the Ocean bent over him, Scott lashed out, striking like a coiled viper. A few desperate seconds of struggling, and the guard lay unconscious at his feet. Scott quickly stripped the guard of his uniform and identity badge, his heart hammering against his ribs. He activated the door and stepped out into the corridor, trying to effect the purposeful stride of a security officer. Scott's intimate knowledge of the station's systems allowed him to slip through gaps in the surveillance network, steadily making his way toward the command sector, toward Janus. Finally, he found himself standing before the door to Janus's office, the metal portal seeming to loom over him. Scott reached into the stolen uniform, retrieving the plasma cutter he'd lifted from a maintenance locker. The brilliant beam sliced through the locking mechanism like it was butter. Scott's fingers danced across the touchscreen, lines of code flickering before his eyes. He muttered curses under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. There had to be something here, some evidence he could use to clear his name. But what he found was so much worse. Files, documents, and schematics filled the screen, details of a fleet being assembled, of invasion plans and bombardment targets. The Oceans weren't just planning to subjugate the station. They were going to invade human space, and Scott had played right into their hands. Janus's plot to frame him, the sabotage, all of it, it was meant to provoke the humans, to justify the war the Oceans craved. Scott felt sick. He had to get this information out. He had to warn humanity. He reached for his stolen identity badge, intending to download the files, but the door suddenly hissed open behind him. Scott spun, dread coiling in his gut. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, human?" Janus's voice dripped with contempt. "You've played your part perfectly. When the humans come for you, they'll find an armada waiting for them." Janus was still gloating, savoring his victory. "Your message will bring your people to us like lambs to the slaughter. By the time they arrive, this station will be—" Scott moved in a blur of desperate speed. He lunged at Janus, grappling for the Ocean's sidearm. Janus snarled in surprise, his grip on the weapon faltering. Scott wrenched it free, jamming the barrel under the alien's scaly chin. "Back off!" Scott roared at the guards, hauling Janus in front of him like a shield. "Drop the weapons or I paint the walls with his brains." The Oceans hesitated, looking to their leader for guidance. Janus, to his credit, only gurgled in incoherent rage. Scott's forearm locked around his windpipe. He backed toward the door, dragging Janus with him. The guards parted reluctantly, unwilling to risk their commander's life. Then Scott was in the corridor, alarms shrieking to life around him as he hauled Janus along. He had no idea where he was going, no real plan. He only knew he had to keep moving, had to find some way to escape, to survive. He needed to think fast. The station's alarms were still blaring, and it wouldn't be long before reinforcements arrived, ones that wouldn't care about Janus's safety. Scott knew his time was running out. With every muscle in his body screaming in protest, Scott pressed the barrel of the weapon harder against Janus's neck, forcing the alien to move faster down the corridor. He had to get to a shuttle or at least somewhere defensible, where he could broadcast a warning to humanity before the Ocean fleet could move against them. They rounded a corner, and Scott's heart leaped into his throat. Up ahead, the corridor opened into a cavernous hangar, the massive bay doors leading directly into the blackness of space. Several small transport shuttles were docked within, their engines idling as they prepared for their next assignments. Scott's mind raced. If he could get to one of those shuttles, he might have a chance. He just needed to figure out how to get past the guards and onto a ship without being blown to bits. "Don't do anything stupid," Scott growled at Janus, his voice low and dangerous. "You know I'll do it. I'll pull this trigger and blast your head off if you don't do exactly what I say." Janus's eyes flashed with fury, but he nodded slightly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Scott could see the calculation in the alien's gaze. Janus was trying to figure out a way out of this, just as desperately as Scott was trying to find a way to survive. They were both running out of options. The hangar was crawling with Ocean soldiers, all of them focused on the standoff unfolding before them. Scott could feel their eyes on him, feel the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. One wrong move, one twitch of a finger, and it would all be over. "Open the hatch to that shuttle," Scott ordered, nodding toward the closest transport, a sleek utilitarian craft built for speed rather than comfort. "Do it now, or I swear I'll blow your head off." Janus hesitated for a split second before nodding to the guards. They reluctantly complied, one of them stepping forward to key in the access code. The hatch hissed open, and Scott could feel the heat of the shuttle's engines warming the cold metal deck beneath his boots. This was it. His one shot at getting out of here alive. With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, Scott shoved Janus forward, using the alien commander as a human, or rather, Ocean shield. The guards tensed, but they didn't fire, unwilling to risk their leader's life. Scott kept moving, dragging Janus with him until they were at the foot of the shuttle's ramp. He backed up slowly, forcing Janus to go ahead of him into the shuttle. The moment they were inside, Scott slammed the hatch shut and locked it, sealing them inside the small craft. He didn't waste any time. Scott darted to the cockpit, shoving Janus into the co-pilot's seat and strapping him in with one hand while the other kept the weapon trained on the alien's head. "Start the engines," Scott ordered, his voice taut with barely controlled panic. "Get us off this station, or I swear to whatever gods you believe in, I'll end you right here." Janus hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing his chances of survival. But Scott's gaze didn't waver, and after a long, tense moment, Janus finally complied. His fingers flew over the controls, and the shuttle's engines roared to life. The hangar doors began to open, revealing the star-speckled void beyond. Scott could feel the shuttle vibrating beneath him, the powerful engines straining against their restraints. "Take us out!" Scott barked. "Now!" With a growl of frustration, Janus punched the throttle and the shuttle shot forward, slipping out of the hangar and into open space. The moment they were clear of the station, Scott reached over and slapped the autopilot, locking in a course for the nearest human outpost. Then, without warning, he smashed the butt of his weapon into Janus's temple, knocking the alien out cold. Janus slumped in his seat, unconscious but alive. Scott slumped back in his chair, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd done it. He'd escaped. But the battle was far from over. As the shuttle hurtled through space, Scott knew he had only bought himself a little time. The Osean fleet was already mobilizing, and it wouldn't be long before they realized what had happened. He needed to get the warning out, to let humanity know what was coming. But first, he had to survive the journey. The message delivered hours passed as the shuttle sped through the void, Scott constantly on edge, expecting the Oceans to appear on the scanners at any moment. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline that had fueled his escape now leaving him exhausted and on the brink of collapse. But he couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. Scott checked the ship's communication systems, relieved to find that they were still functional. He quickly set up an encrypted transmission and began to record his message, his voice hoarse from the strain. "This is Scott Gordon, mechanic aboard the Ocean station orbiting the gas giant XR-43. The Oceans are planning an invasion of human space. They've framed me for sabotage, and I barely escaped with my life. I've got proof of their plans, but I'm on the run. Sending coordinates now. Need immediate assistance." He encrypted the transmission and sent it out, praying that it would reach human ears before the Oceans could intercept it. The message was now speeding through space, just like him, a desperate plea for help. But even as the message left the shuttle, Scott knew he couldn't just wait around for help to arrive. He had to stay one step ahead of the Oceans if he wanted to live long enough to see humanity's response. His mind raced as he considered his options. The shuttle was fast, but it wouldn't hold up in a fight. If the Oceans caught up to him, he was done for. He needed to find a way to disappear, to hide until help arrived. The shuttle's navigation console chimed, signaling that they were approaching a dense asteroid field. Scott's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and desperation. If he could lose himself in the asteroids, maybe, just maybe, he could buy himself enough time. He keyed in a new course, angling the shuttle toward the asteroid field. The ship responded sluggishly, its autopilot struggling to keep up with the sudden change in trajectory. But Scott didn't care. He had to take the risk. As the shuttle dove into the asteroid field, Scott disabled the autopilot, taking manual control. The dense rocks loomed on the screen, a chaotic jumble of metal and ice. He gritted his teeth and gripped the controls, threading the shuttle through the narrow gaps between the tumbling stones. The ship rocked and shuddered as smaller fragments of debris pelted the hull, but Scott kept pushing forward. He couldn't afford to slow down. The Oceans wouldn't be far behind. Suddenly, the shuttle's sensors blared a warning. A massive Ocean warship had entered the asteroid field, its powerful engines shoving asteroids aside as it bore down on Scott's position. His heart leaped into his throat. There was no way he could outrun that thing. Scott's mind raced. He needed a plan and fast. His eyes darted across the controls, searching for anything that could give him an edge. Then he saw it, the emergency beacon. Of course. He could rig the beacon to emit a decoy signal, leading the Oceans away from his true position. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. With trembling hands, Scott accessed the shuttle's systems and began reprogramming the beacon. He set it to transmit a false signal, one that mimicked the shuttle's energy signature, and then launched the beacon into the asteroid field. Seconds later, the shuttle's sensors picked up the Ocean warship changing course, following the decoy signal deeper into the asteroid field. Scott let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It had worked. For now. But he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Oceans would figure out the ruse soon enough, and when they did, they'd come for him with everything they had. Scott guided the shuttle deeper into the asteroid field, searching for a place to hide. He spotted a large asteroid with a network of caves carved into its surface, a perfect hiding spot. He maneuvered the shuttle into one of the caves, powering down the engines to avoid detection. The ship settled onto the rocky floor, the only sound the soft ticking of cooling metal. Scott leaned back in his seat, every muscle in his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done all he could. Now, all he could do was wait and hope. As Scott stared out at the dark, jagged walls of the cave, his thoughts turned to Earth. Had his message gotten through? Were they already mobilizing to defend against the Ocean threat?